Right, so here we are in Wrocław, Poland, for the 15th T-Mobile New Horizons Film Festival. Neil Young and Michael Patterson speaking about some of the films we've seen in this historic city, which you can see behind us.
Already the quality is better than the last one, I think. Yes, there's two reasons. It's my second time in New Horizons, third time in Wrocław, because I was here last November for the American Film Festival, the 5th edition of that. But there's two main reasons why I like this festival very much. The first of which is that there's no real hierarchy between press and the public. Every morning at 8:30, as is legendary at this festival, everyone is scrambling online for the live booking system, and within 4 seconds or 3 seconds, you said yesterday, not that you were counting the seconds, I'm sure, but Son of Soul tickets went for 140 tickets went in about 3 seconds.
That was this morning, yes. They all went, well, certainly less than 10 seconds.
And the second reason why I like this is because as a critic, as a member of the press, I get to see lots of titles from Cannes Film Festival without having to go to Cannes every year. Chief among which this week has been The Assassin, the new film by Hou Hsiao-hsien. And we saw it first of all on the second day I think we were here. And I saw it again for the second time yesterday because I felt that it needed and would deserve and reward a second viewing. Because firstly I slept through a large part of the first, and you felt that it was more complicated and problematic than I did as a film.
Yeah, I did have a reservation to see it a second time, but to be honest, the first time was enough for me. So I'm happy to catch up with it at some point later in my life. But I just didn't get very much out of this film. Maybe it's because I haven't seen so many of Hou Hsiao-hsien's films as I think it's actually Hou Hsiao-hsien, but we'll call him Hou because it's Hou because it sounds Who's on first because it sounds funnier. But apparently it is Hou Hsiao-hsien. Who hell he? We should have rehearsed it. So yeah, but I know that you did a lot of background because you were doing an article about this director earlier this year, so you immersed yourself in his filmography. I've only seen one film by him before, which was Summer at Grandpa's, which was one of his very early films. So, but you know, should one need to know all about a director's background before you see any of his films? I
didn't. It wasn't quite a full immersion. I reviewed the very good Richard Tscherkassky edited book by from the Film Museum released last year on this director, and I watched what films I could, which isn't many, but there is a travelling retrospective at the moment. But so I haven't seen that many films. I do know, and went into this knowing that this is a kind of an experimental work for him. It's his first kind of kung fu film, and I went into it expecting. To be honest, it's more action-packed than I was expecting.
Because to say kung fu brings up images of like Bruce Lee and Enter the Dragon. In the, I think it's wuxia genre of martial arts, shall we say? Because this is a very, you know, whatever one's reservations are, it's a very kind of graceful film, and then there are moments of violence, but it's in no way like explicit. There's no blood. It's all very kind of tasteful, which was one of the problems I had with it. But anyway, if you just like for people who don't know much about it, what is the story of the assassin? Who is the assassin?
The assassin is a female who's a woman in is it 9th century China, I think. We both came out with the first screening and thought it was nearly incomprehensible, the plot. And the second viewing, I gleaned a little more, but still, synopsis-wise, I'm a little bit.
How many views of this film do you think it needs before you understand it?
Oh, I'll get it on third time. But sadly, I leave early tomorrow morning, and there are no further screenings anyway, so I'll catch it at another point. But I must say that the second viewing, I got a lot more from it. Story-wise, it's about somebody who's trained as an assassin who is released back into her community and in a part of China that is trying to reinforce itself in its garrisons against the court, the imperial court. And there's courtly intrigue mixed with a little romance, I guess, but it's kind of a non-event romance. But I did get a lot more out of it on the second viewing. I do think, paradoxically, Hou's limitations as an action director are exposed whenever there's action on screen, and I think it's at its best when it's being more contemplative, because it's as a landscape filmmaker, I would love to see him make a landscape film and the kinds of films that we like, because I think this is a very, very beautiful film. The cinematography is exceptional.
By Mark Lee Ping Bin, who I think I'm right in saying shot Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon for Ang Lee, which was the film that I kept thinking of while watching it, which was, you know, maybe it's a crass comparison to compare Ang Lee and Hou Hsiao-hsien, but, you know, Taiwanese filmmakers making a first foray into the martial arts genre, and Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon, which is a strangely forgotten film. It's a film that very few people talk about these days, but at the time, it was going to be the first foreign film to win the Oscar for Best Picture. Didn't win in the end. It was a huge hit everywhere. A beautiful film. I still remember the scene where there's the fight through the trees, and with the wire work, and they kind of seem to float through the trees. And there's bits in this where she's very cat-like and she jumps down from a height. But to be honest with you,
making a sound.
Without making a sound. But to be honest, you know, I can see the beauty of the film, but I don't see it as any more beautiful than Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon, which had beauty and movement. It wasn't just static contemplations of landscape. And of course, you know, there's a wonderful shot at the end of a tree. And that's all very nice, but to me, it's cinema, and cinema should move. And this just didn't move, and it didn't move me.
I think that gives Hou's cinema a disservice, actually. This film in particular, because it's not tripod fixed framing, it's not static. There is movement there, and actually, I found it quite unpretentious and unassuming in the way its camera flows, but it's not actually making a point of its elaborate choreography in the way that, you know, Crouching Tiger, if we must persist on that comparison.
And we must.
But
I mean, when you say it doesn't bring attention, there's several scenes which are shot through kind of gauzy curtains.
And we thought of doing this Partycrashers video through a dirty net curtain, which would have had a profound effect on it.
Because that to me is very much calling attention to artifice and you know, historical art and filmmaking which has these obstructions in a way that it just sort of sat there, and I didn't think he kind of did anything with it.
Yeah, I want to understand it, yeah, and on a third view, and it's like, oh, the net curtains really kind of fit, but I'm still not sure what I feel about that. It didn't annoy me as much as it did you, and I must say that I've not seen candles or flames look as good as this since Barry Lyndon, which I wasn't alive to see first time round.
Which I haven't seen at all.
Okay,
but that kind of is an interesting way of bridging to a subject that I wanted to talk about with this festival, in that The Assassin is one film that we've both seen, but it's such a big festival and there are so many films on at the same time. There are, I think, 8 or 10 screens, whatever it is. 9 screens. Is it 9 screens? 9 screens. And you speak to people and it's as if you're at 2 different film festivals, because you say, oh, what are you seeing tomorrow? And there are very few points of contact. And like, for instance, Marseille, where we were a few weeks ago, it's a much kind of smaller repertoire, and everybody tends to see the same films. And you go to some very small festivals where everybody sees virtually the same program. Whereas here, you can spend here 7 or 8 days, and at the end of it, very few points of contact. I mean, all right, there's the big films which everybody's trying to get, but for instance, you couldn't get a ticket for Gaspar Noé's Love, which is a kind of one that everybody wants.
Yeah, I was looking forward to seeing that, sitting in the back row for it, like I did with the Duke of Burgundy. But
so there aren't that many films we can actually have a dialogue about, because we just haven't seen those films.
Yeah, but it's not like a geographically sprawling festival like Rotterdam. Like, so all 9 screens are in the same cinema. On paper, it has all the ingredients of what I think would be a very kind of off-puttingly incestuous place to be. But actually, it's because it's not like industry-focused in the same way that these other bloated festivals are, and because it is a showcase of films that the public very much wants to see. And I saw my second viewing of The Assassin. I sat dead centre in the cinema with you know, surrounded by a Polish audience who was very appreciative, very, you know, for the most part anyway.
Any walkouts?
I counted less walkouts in the second viewing than I did in the first. There was certainly not as many walkouts as there was in the Guy Maddin picture that we saw earlier this week,
which is the Forbidden Room, which was the first film that we saw, and again one of the few that we can actually sort of discuss in that way. This was in Berlin Festival, it premiered there, and it was much talked about. It's a kind of homage, like most Guy Maddin films, to early cinema, shot in the style of kind of 1930s colorized early sound films, dream logic, 2 hours and 10 minutes of it, and I found it almost insufferable. And I somehow stuck with it to the end because I kind of wanted to see what the payoff was and whether there was going to be some grand thing. But there's just something about the way that he makes the films. There's something about the way that he puts the camera too close to the characters' faces. There's something very kind of over the top and insistent, and either you surrender to that and you have this wonderfully transporting experience, or you just, it's like fingernails on the blackboard.
It's, you know, like shorts like Sissy Boy's Slapstick, I think that energy can be sustained
and the heart of the world.
To say that on this occasion it isn't quite sustained is both an understatement and a very obvious one. But I'd much rather move on past that film, actually. Cause,
well, another one that we saw, which involved even greater involvement and concentration, was Arabian Nights, or The 1001 Nights as it's known in Poland, by Miguel Gomes. And this was probably the most critically acclaimed film from Cannes. It's a three-part film. Well, it's actually three films, which run a total of, I think it's like 2 hours 10 minutes, 2 hours 10 minutes, something like that. So it's it's a big commitment. One which, after seeing the first part, I checked out of, because the thing with here is the second screening I wanted to go and see. There was a chance of seeing a Philippe Garrel film from the 70s, legendary film on 35mm, and I kind of thought I will be able to see Arabian Nights elsewhere. And to be honest, the first part of it didn't grab me enough that I was like, oh, I can't wait to see part two. And it's like serial. It's like any serial, whether it's Charles Dickens or Twin Peaks or True Detective. You've got to finish one episode desperate to see the next one. Otherwise, it's like it becomes a chore. Now, I know you did watch all three parts of this over 3 days. So, what was it? Was the investment of time worthwhile? And what is your? Do you think the critical adulation in Cannes was justified? In a word.
No, it wasn't, and no, it wasn't. But that's 3 words, so 6 words each. I did stick around for the end. Your excuses sound like apologies to me, as they always do. But I accept.
You can be apologetically excusing.
I did stick around for parts 2 and 3.
The concept of the film is what? Just for people who don't know what it is.
It makes a point of opening each part of saying it's not an adaptation of Arabian Nights, even though it borrows from its structure. And for me, the structure, at a conceptual level, this film is for me fatally flawed, because it's kind of a portmanteau film of that collects little vignettes. Well, they're not little; they're 40 minutes each, at least, I think. But about fact-based stories that have emerged over the last 2 years in Portugal, and it's framed through a fictionalization. So it's framed in such a way that they are told as stories by this character Scheherazade, who we only get to see properly in the third act. And you know, the third part, there's a good standalone documentary in there on bird trappers in Lisbon, in a very kind of rundown part next to the airport there in Lisbon.
Why are they trapping the birds, to eat them or what?
No, they're training chaffinches to compete in singing competitions. And you know, there's a charming ethnographic portrait there, kind of dying to get out, like a heart beating in a rib cage,
or a chaffinch in a little box.
Exactly.
Because in the first part, it starts off with this very strong, I thought, opening in which it's kind of funny, and it's a combination of fiction and documentary. Gomez says he's very touched by the situation in Portugal. He wants to do a film about the Portuguese situation, the Portuguese people. Then he kind of runs off, and the crew is following him. It's very much like the beginning of Our Beloved Month of August, where you have this acknowledgement that what you're watching is a film made by Miguel Gomes. It's the 21st century. We can all be adults and realise the artifice. But then the first story that you get is this thing about international bankers having gigantic penises and becoming trapped with enormous erections. Is this fact-based?
Presumably, I have to believe him there. But it's almost as if he's acknowledging the fact that something is profound and widespread as an economic crisis that Europe's currently, you know, undergoing and enduring, and Lisbon in particular, or Portugal in particular, sorry. It can't be contained to just one film, so he has to make 3, and it can't be contained to just that one theme, and so he has to be this he has to make this very unwieldy epic that sometimes does touch upon things that are very pertinent, I think. But for the most part, he insists upon this framing technique that I think is redundant. I think the juvenile humour is run into the ground, and each separate short within this film. There's a one in part two, like a trial scene that expands into this systematic kind of diagnosis of a system that is obviously failed in very, very visible and evident ways. But the allegorical ramifications of that are framed in such a, to use a term I've just said, a juvenile way.
But he does say at the beginning of the film that he's not intelligent enough to think in metaphors or symbolism, and as a filmmaker he can only deal with things directly. So in a way he's kind of said to you, the symbolism you're going to see in this film isn't really very good because I'm not intelligent enough, and also we've got to be aware of, I think the word that he used is dandyism, like dandismo. And so in a way it's like he's having his cake and eating it. It's like whatever he does is justified because he's put this frame behind it. Oh, you think it's juvenile? Of course it's juvenile. You think my symbolism is not very good? Of course it's not very good. So in a way the film's completely critic-proof, and of course it's been critically adored and hailed as a kind of masterpiece, a current masterpiece of modern cinema. But on the other hand, given the way that he sort of set all these traps, the problem that I had was I had to get through all these traps to actually get to what the film was about, and it was just like after 2 hours and 10 minutes of it, the prospect of spending another 5 hours doing this when there was alternatives in other screens. And as I say, I'm not saying I'm not going to watch part two, but I couldn't see the film that everybody had come out of Cannes raving about and saying was terrific. Another one that was, if we could move on from Arabian Nights, maybe, or do you have to wrap it up?
No, we may.
Yeah, the other one that was another critical wow from Cannes is The Treasure by Porumboiu, which again I struggled with. I actually saw this in Marseille. You didn't see it there. Well, and you saw it here, and I know that you're a sort of fan of Porumboiu. So for you, this was back to good form for old Corneliu.
Yeah, well, I wouldn't speak in those kinds of terms, form and back to form or whatever. I don't think I'm a fan. I very much love Police Adjective, although it's been a couple of years since I last saw it. So,
isn't it in your top 100 films of all time?
My top 10, or it was, but
top 10 of all time.
Of all time, but I, as we know, every 2 years I revise this list, and this September I'm due a revision, and for the first time I'm not going to consult the previous list, so I'm just going to make it, and the French Connection may be dethroned. Who knows? God. It won't be. But anyway,
when I last did this, my number one was dethroned, so you just be careful.
Oh, well. So The Treasure, I was very much surprised by it, and taken off guard really. Because it continues in the same way that Metabolism, or When Night Falls in Bucharest, or whatever it's called, the last one that the last narrative fiction he did, it continues in that way. The sobriety of the cinematography here is, and in combination with kind of deliberately banal framing, for me, I thought, oh God, we're in for a bit of a unendurable film here.
When you say sobriety of the cinematography, you mean that the DOP wasn't drunk or what?
No, I mean this kind of very deliberately dank, dreary, and it's not like...
But this is Eastern Europe, which has to be shown in a dank, dreary...
It's not a stylized miserableism. It's like, it's austere, and it's... I mean, I don't like that term, but...
and the camera only moves in the very last shot of the film, which we won't say what that is. Apparently, I read a very august critic who said that the camera never moves apart from the last shot.
No, it does. It does. It doesn't move in terms of spatially, but it moves on its axis, as these Romanian films tend to do. So it's drawn attention to the fact that we can move within a panoramic scale, but we can't move the Z-axis.
Which is also true of Afarim by Radu Juda.
We can't intervene upon the action. But anyway, this is a film about two neighbours in Bucharest, one of whom approaches the other for a loan, and he says he can pay it back with treasure that he thinks is buried in his brother's house that he's inherited from his family, and in the garden of that from pre-revolution times. And so they embark upon this treasure hunt in the garden with the help of a metal detector, in terms of the actual person hired to detect metal and the actual device in which is used to detect it. And it expands in ways that you don't expect it to. It deepens in ways that you don't expect it to. My biggest laugh in the cinema this week has been at this film when a hole is being dug, let's say, and one character asks another, "How deep do you think it is?" and the other one jumps in, disappears completely, and submerged beneath the soil, and I was just like creased. I was just.
Was anybody else laughing in the cinema?
Yeah, but I think they were laughing more at my laugh. Because I was at the back commanding everyone else's responses as I
like playing them like an orchestra.
Like this is a comedy film, everyone is allowed to laugh, so everyone was. But you didn't like it?
I was just at the end. I kind of thought, is that all there is to the treasure? I mean, I know this is kind of maybe the point of it, and they find the treasure, and well, they find something. We won't say what it is, and then you realise that they keep talking about Robin Hood all the way through the film, because it's the father trying to like improve his status in the eye of the son, and they're always reading these Robin Hood stories, and then this all ties in. And at the end, I was like, well, this is a neat little box that you've done, and you put a ribbon on it, and there we are. And I'm like, fine, but I'm not going to come out of it and go, oh my God, you got to see The Treasure by Poramboyu. But I was tempted for a second view, because I do like 1208 Bucharest. I like Police Adjective. I give him the benefit of the doubt. The second game where he sits watching a football game with his dad, I just kind of felt that he was treading water. And this, I don't know, I didn't think it was doing anything like new with Romanian cinema, certainly compared with Afarim, Radu Juda, the Western set in 1835, about persecution of gypsies. That's the kind of directions I want Romanian cinema to go in, not these little parables which have this kind of black humour in them. I'm wary of us talking too much about films that were in Cannes, because here we are at the Wrocław New Horizons.
That's all we've seen.
I would just mention the best film that I saw that was in Cannes is the Exquisite Corpus, which I know you haven't seen, by Peter Tscherkassky, which is a 19-minute film that was in the Cannes, I think it was. And because it's a short and because it's experimental, it got like 1/50th of the coverage of any film in competition, because the way that international film criticism works is that you have to look at mainstream films, you look at after big art movies, and experimental films, even if they're by Peter Tscherkassky, who's been one of the leading avant-garde directors for 20, 30 years, barely get covered. They only get covered in the most esoteric magazines. Exquisite Corpus is 19-minute black and white found footage, like all of his films are. 19, yeah. Where he manipulates black and white footage normally to create something new. And what he manipulates here is some kind of 60s porn film with people going to an island and having these strange sexual encounters. And I'm sure there are other experimental porn films. I'm sure he's not inventing a new genre here. But this was kind of 19 minutes of quite steamy raunch, which, you don't really expect to get within the frame of austere Austrian experimental cinema. No plot, it is out there, and it's not for everybody, and I can see why it would be tough. But for me, it had a kind of brilliance and a genius, and you just know that you're in the presence of somebody who knows exactly what he's doing, he knows how to manipulate stuff to come out with something that just blows your mind. I mean, I know that's a kind of ridiculous thing to say, but coming out of that film, I generally wanted to rush up to people and go, oh my God, you've got to go and see this film. They only showed it once, but it will be shown in other festivals. So my number one recommendation of this festival is The Exquisite Corpus by Peter Tscherkassky. Your number one so far?
It's hard to say. I mean, I've been watching a lot of the Lithuanian retrospectives. So
Why?
Because I hope to write about it. And so I've delved into a cinema that I previously have no familiarity with.
What distinguishes the Lithuanian cinema?
Well, I went into it expecting kind of a slow hog, but actually it's at least from the 60s, 70s era, this stuff is very kind of energetic, a lot of flash cuts, a lot of dealing with, things that are palpably of an urgency at that point.
Because these are all films obviously made within the Soviet system.
USSR, yeah, and so there's no slow, long takes, and characters talk. It's been very refreshing this week to see films from this part of the world and from this era, and then to juxtapose that with, Lithuanian cinema and old Soviet territories that are being made now.
The one I saw last night, which was Seven Invisible Men from 2005 by Sharunas Bartas. And this is one of those films I've always wanted to see because of the title, Seven Invisible Men. What can this possibly be? And the synopsis made it sound fantastic. A bleak road movie going through Eastern Europe, the wilds, violence, gangsters, and all that kind of thing. And you watch it, and it's the most static, uninvolving crap. And I watched it for an hour and 20 minutes and walked out with 35 minutes to go. And this just ticked every cliched box. Bartas, I've seen a couple of his films, like one of them, Eastern Drift, but he's just got this love of horribly intense close-ups, minimal dialogue, sinister characters staring at each other, and that didn't make me want to investigate more. But obviously, what you've said to me previously was that, like, the Lithuanian cinema made within the Soviet Union tends to be fresher. I mean, not that we're saying that the Soviet system was a marvelous thing which should be brought back, but in terms of the films that were made in that period, it can't be a coincidence that they're often the more worthwhile films that have stood the test of time.
He's such a damn commie. That's what they'll be saying at that point when they watch this.
We're gonna put a big red star over
oh my God, he just said that. I think those films also look outward to a world that exists around them, and they're responding to things in ways that are very, as I say, palpable.
But a lot of them seem to be about, like, Second World War, immediate aftermath, and it seemed as though there was a whole, like in Britain, you know, we're still fighting the Second World War to a certain degree, and certainly in Soviet cinema, endless films glorifying, you know, the Great Patriotic War and all that kind of thing. And the one that you saw, No One Died, what was it?
Nobody wanted to die, although there are deaths in the film, very sadly. But there's...
That's post-war or during the war.
It's dealing with a history that's still unfolding at that point. You know, tensions arising within Lithuania in response to the Russian government. You know, and wanting to break from that.
Because Lithuania had independence before. Then after the war, we have, you know, it becomes an SSR. It doesn't have autonomy anymore.
Yeah, and it's dealing with that in very explicit ways. And as I say, looking outward, which kind of cinema that I like. Whereas, interestingly, post-Soviet cinema, if we can call it that, tends to kind of retreat inward in a similar way to, I think, Jafar Panahi did before he had such restrictions imposed upon him. Even when you know, the filmmakers responding to and making films at the time of the Iranian Revolution were well, kind of looking outward, and then all of a sudden, it's kind of similar to what the Romanian New Wave did very prematurely, I think. There's a retreat inward, and it becomes about the reflexivity of the medium and the limitations of cinema and how we frame such histories. And for me, it's like you get into very banal discussions then. Filmmakers tend to... I mean, to come back to Porumbayu, he's made 3 films now in as many years, and you get the sense, not to sound too cynical about it, but to sustain that kind of work rate, something has to be a casualty there, and I think the casualty is a really true, considered way of looking at the world. So it's kind of like dime a dozen. I can make a film each year.
Yeah, but Fassbinder made 12, and he had an engagement with the world.
12 films a year.
If you include TV stuff and TV movies, he'd have done 12 films a year, several years.
He made he certainly made 12 feature films in addition to TV and stage plays in the first 5 years of his career, which is, like, you know, phenomenal.
And these are in my mind because there's a documentary about him here, Fassbinder to Love Without Demands by Christian Brad Thompson, which I saw and which you didn't. Which, you know, predictably it can't mirror the brilliance of Fassbinder, but it does remind you what a figure he was, and there is nobody like that in Europe now. And Porumbayu, even if he makes 2 films a year, I just don't see him ever getting to that level.
Because it's an outlook thing, isn't it? I mean, like, Fassbinder was able to sustain that kind of creative output because he had a very considered way of looking at the world, very principled. And, you know, let's say he was a staunch anti-capitalist in ways that went beyond the cinema and his cinematic output.
But don't you think it's also because he was making films from the late 60s into the 70s at a time when the RAF, known in certain places as the Baader-Meinhof gang and others, there was a political tumult which he could have entered. He could have been a Ulrike Meinhof figure, but his way of doing it was to express it through cinema. And like in Germany now, I mean, I think there are some excellent filmmakers in Germany, but you don't get that degree of political engagement among the general people. You don't get that sense of, like, there could be a revolution here tomorrow. I mean, people like whinge about Merkel. Oh, it's bad what they did with Greece. But you can't, you know, you look back at the way Germany was in the 70s, Italy was in the 70s, Britain was in the 70s, and it's not a coincidence you get this very engaged political cinema and individuals. It happened. I mean, Fassbinder was a freak, but he happened to be a freak in the right place at the right time.
Well, as I've said before, I think there's a central paradox there between on the one hand, the deindustrialization and therefore the depoliticization of a left, of an organized international left, and the so-called democratization of cinema, whereby anyone can now pick up a camera in theory. Of course, that's obviously overstating things, and it's very easy to overemphasize, but. I think that kind of central contradiction there is resulting in lots of films that, on formal levels, kind of may work, may not work, but for me they're not genuinely radical films because they're not engaged with and not part of a wider upheaval. In any case, they don't really show me any signs of wanting to touch upon that. I mean, you know, to come back to the Gomez film, if I may, that is a film that purports to be about the Lisbon crisis, the Portuguese crisis and the Portuguese people, and yet I can't see the common folk, if you like, engaging with it at all. I mean, you know, the Polish audiences here are very, very good with their work. They will go to see it, and I went to see the Arabian Nights second viewing of that, and it was a very anemic crowd indeed.
So is there anywhere where there is that degree of struggle and then that manifests itself in cinema? I'm thinking possibly Turkey. I saw a very good Turkish film called Sivas, which is about dogfighting in Turkey. And it touches on political, economic issues in a light way, and is a watchable, accessible film. And I think it's a very strong film. I know you didn't see it. Turkey is often said, like, if there's going to be a revolution, it's going to be in Turkey, partly because of Erdogan's craziness, and the nature of Turkish society is going through massive changes at the minute. And there's loads of films coming out of Turkey, which is a country of like 70, 90 million people, whatever it is. Do you see that as a potential, or maybe Greece, somewhere like that?
I think if audiences start forcing filmmakers to make films that are relevant to them, then filmmakers will. But at the moment, I think too many artists in general, through the ways in which art is funded and through the ways in which it is made, is kind of at too far removed from any kind of wider struggle. But they will be compelled to make films that are relevant to the people and relevant to a struggle when the struggle compels them to. So it's kind of a catch-22. But you know, you look at no two historical epochs are the same, and so we can't make it analogous to 1960s Germany, of course. But like, you know, you look at somebody like Fassbinder, who was able to sustain this energy and output because of the things that were happening around him. And for me, the marvels of cinema from year to year now are getting fewer and far between. You know, they're getting better, let's say, but they are getting rarer. And you know,
is that also like a subjective thing because you're getting older? You've seen too many films. You go to too many festivals. You're becoming jaded, and you blame it now on cinema. You project that outward onto cinema.
Well, the best film I've seen this week is The Leopard by Gino Visconti, which I'd seen, which I hadn't seen before. I've had it on DVD unwatched.
Visconti, who was a duke.
But that does not mean he can't make great cinema that's interested in society as a thing of class. And the class tensions here are things of absolute consequence. And, you know, obviously hindsight's a wonderful thing, but he was, you know, telling a history that in which society is the sum of all of these different fluxes and fluctuations, and the tensions that emerge from that, and things are always shifting. So things are shifting now before we have time to know it. So of course I'm able to be more critical of the cinema that's being made at the moment because I'm living through that history. Whereas, you know, films from the 1960s and 70s we're able to judge.
Although it's interesting that the reason that the film was shown here wasn't because of its social comedy, it was because it was shown in a section of costumes, films that had lots of good costumes in them.
Oh yeah, I didn't watch it for the story. I only went for the suits and you know, the trousers. Yeah. But yeah, this is, you know, it's a fantastic film. It was on DCP sadly, but it did show me the it was, you know, nice restoration. Not to harp on about, I don't know, the difference between a 4K restoration and a 2K one, but it was
you will when if you put them side by side, as Keanu Reeves would say.
But it looked nice. But yeah, it just makes me now want to see it on 35mm. And this came out of the Titanus production, which may lead into the Pasolini film last night.
By Abel Ferrara, which I did the introduction Q&A for.
I was thinking also of the actual Pasolini film that screened after that, which we both saw.
The Gospel according to St. Matthew, and Pasolini is obviously a kind of model of a politically engaged artist who writes, he makes films, he's a poet, he you know, was a very productive guy, made enemies all over the place in the church, in the political scene, was horribly killed in the prime of his career. And Abel Ferrara was saying, you know, this guy knew what he was doing, he went to these places, he lived on the edge, he paid the price, all that kind of thing. You know, you kind of look back 40 years later, and it's the anniversary this year. which you can't even think of a filmmaker who would be killed, or you know, if a filmmaker was killed, or maybe the state killed him. You know, you'd have to literally go to like somewhere like Iran or Turkey. But even there, you know, what Iranian filmmaker, you know, there's house arrest and there's different things, but the idea of a filmmaker being so dangerous, like Abel Ferrara, you know, has had his critics in the time, and he's like a dangerous guy. But, you know, the idea that the CIA would bump off Abel Ferrara, but as I always say, the data worry is when the CIA isn't bumping you off.
Yeah, of course. And I went into this film last night, Gospel According to St. Matthew, having only seen Medea.
The Gospel According to St. Matthew about Jesus, who was also bumped off by the powers that be.
Yeah, and so there's interesting parallels between Pasolini and in ways that I didn't expect, actually, because firstly, I went into Pasolini very ignorant of the fact of the circumstances in which he died. And the film is kind of a deliberately banal reading of the final 24 hours of his life. This is Pasolini, not Gospel According. But yeah. So as I say, it's deliberately banal. So it's like when the you know the final death does come, I'm like, oh, okay, that's pretty brutal, actually, to be honest. But its brutality is underscored by the fact that he doesn't make much of it. So it kind of comes from nowhere.
It's almost as if Pasolini is kind of killed by accident, because a guy jumps into a car and drives off, and like with spoilers, goes over his head, and you kind of think, oh, so cock-up conspiracy. But I think it is ambiguous. I mean, I think that because people said, oh, you suggest he was just killed by a bunch of punks, you know.
Yeah, but I think that's kind of refreshing, really, and it kind of underscores the tragedy, I think.
But then straight afterwards we saw Gospel According to St. Matthew, which is very explicitly a guy who says, look, I'm going to annoy all the powers that be, they are going to kill me, but don't worry, I'm going to come back after 3 days. And he does.
And if you don't believe me, then, you know, death to you. But Pasolini's refreshingly short as a biopic of its sort. It's 90 minutes, whereas Gospel According to St. Matthew makes a point of being 2.5 hours, and it's this sprawling life according to St. Matthew. But it's... You know, it's a very good film. I think they're both good films. But Gospel According to St. Matthew, it was great to put a film to the reference that I only know through Casino, through the music of that and the opening credits. And it's, you know, it's a moving piece of cinema that I didn't expect it to be honest. And
also that there's in both films, like the mother finds out about the son dying. I mean, obviously Mary sees her son crucified in front of her, and the scene where Pasolini's mother gets the news is really an amazing scene.
Yeah, it's very moving, and like you could almost say belatedly so, but I don't mean to under-describe or do the film a disservice, because as I say, it makes a point of the kind of quotidian details of a man's life that is going to end prematurely, that he isn't aware of, not like Jesus, who knew everything and knows everything in that film and makes a point of knowing everything.
The thing about the Jesus story, having played Pontius Pilate myself at school, and I made him very much the hero of the story, I could never quite work out whether it was like a bad thing that Jesus was crucified. Was he killed by evil people, and ideally he would have lived to 90 and changed the whole world? But no, you watch this film and you're reminded that, like, this was written, this has to happen, I know what the deal is here, kids. But then the bit that I never understand with the Jesus story, this is kind of getting slightly off topic here, is when he goes, oh Lord, why have you forsaken me? It's like, look, you followed the script here, you know, just die, you'll come back after 3 days. And I think Jesus, when he's on the cross, he's like, oh Dad, come on, you know, didn't think I was going to be like crucified, you know. But anyway, this is a theological discussion. Maybe if we could start wrapping it up, is there any other recommendation? Maybe a more obscure film from the bowels of the festival that you have looked into?
Okay, so to be honest, I saw, again, apart from the Lithuanian stuff, I haven't really seen any obscurities, let's say. But I will say, not to reconcile with the broad critical base that I disparaged for loving Inherent Vice and making a hoo-ha over that. I gave it a second turn this week because I could. I had a free slot. And watching it with a packed capacity Polish audience who were finding it very, very funny indeed, I found that, you know, their laughter infectious. And I must say I was wrong the first time round. I know you're not a fan of the film. I kind of was very, very underwhelmed when I first saw it. And I walked 6 miles to see it at a cinema in the UK because I am boycotting my local independent cinema there. And so I walked 6 miles to the nearest multiplex. And
I'm sure Paul Thomas Anderson appreciates your sacrifice.
I'm sure he does. And this was like, okay, it's a great soundtrack. There's stuff happening there in terms of its cinematography.
Crazy close-ups.
Amazing. And and I think, you know, it works for me the second time round. But as we know, you don't agree with if a film doesn't work the first time round, then it shouldn't be given another chance.
No, Zero Effect by Jake Kasdan. I saw it the first time, didn't like it, went to see it the second time. But that's like 1997. That might be the only time. No, of course, it depends on the mood you're in, many other things. And like Paul Thomas Anderson, one of my favourite filmmakers, I've got to give him the benefit of the day. But I came out of that and I'm like, not only can I not watch that again, I don't think I can watch any new films by Paul Thomas Anderson. The guy's lost whatever mojo he ever had. And he had great mojo, to use a critical term here. And I just watched that and I thought, God, run out of ideas, run out of vim, run out of vigour. And he's dead to me as a filmmaker. It's like Ron Howard after Cinderella Man. This is a completely ludicrous comparison. But after that, I was like, never going to watch another of his films. And with Paul Thomas Anderson, I'm like, if the next one interests me, I might watch it. Which, considering he made like 3 great masterpieces in a row with Magnolia, Boogie Nights and Punch Drunk Love, which is one of my favourite films, that I'm even sitting here saying that makes me bleed in my heart. But I do have one from the bowels of the festival to wrap up on, which is Grzegorz Krolikowicz's Neighbours, or Neighbourhooders, as they're calling it.
You've been rehearsing that name.
I have been rehearsing it all night, and this is one of the great Polish directors that nobody's ever heard of, so of course I love him. He made various masterpieces in the 70s, horrible, assaultive, unwatchable critiques of communism.
They had a retrospective at True False, did they?
They had a mini retrospective at True False Festival in America this year where I saw Through and Through, which I think is his first long film. It's like a demented honeymoon killers. The Dancing Hawk from 77, which is one of the most searingly anti-communist films ever made within the communist system, but is so unwatchable and hideously assaultive and nightmarish that the censors, I think, just ran from the room. But if you can stick with it, it's fantastically brilliant. And then this week, his first new film for 19 years I saw, which is called Neighbourhooders. And I'm not saying it's up quite the level of his...
19 years, 1-9.
1-9. I'm not saying it's like the level of his great 70s and 80s films. But, you know, this is obviously one of the best... For me, it's a better film than Ida, for instance. It's obviously one of the best films from this part of the world of the last few years. It's a film that directly addresses political and social issues. It's about a tenement block in Łódź in Poland and how people interact socially. The film premiered at the Gdynia Festival in September last year here in Poland. And it's played here, and it hasn't played outside Poland yet. It had made no ripples, and I just think it is utterly baffling and bizarre and a complete black eye for international cinephilia that a major film by a major director can be 10 months later never have played a festival outside the country. So I would say if there's one film that I want to sort of champion from this festival and get into and get people to see, because people are going to see The Assassin, people are going to see Arabian Nights, but if people don't get the chance to see Neighbourhooders by one of the great figures of European cinema, then you kind of think, why do we bother? Why do we bother?
Because we have to collect anecdotes. Just to quote a pal of mine, Bobby Lowe, that's what he responded to once when I asked what the meaning of life was, to collect anecdotes. So there we are. There we have it.
Is that an anecdote?
No, that wasn't an anecdote. It was a kind of a one-line manifesto, let's say.
And that's all the best manifestos are one-line manifestos. Thank you, Michael.
Thank you, Neil.